Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Inshallah, we're going to start our next conversation on Generations Rise. So just place your attention toward the audience, and Harun will begin the conversation.
I know I'm loud, but come on. Give me a mic.
Assalamu alaikum. All right, everyone hear me? Good. I have nothing interesting to say beyond that. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Generation Rise. My name is Harun Mughal. I am the moderator, or as I've been described, the instigator. My job is to get the conversation going. We have a very distinguished panel here. What I'm going to try to do is basically let each of them speak as much as possible. And if the conversation dies down, your questions will be brought up to me. And then I'll filter them for the most interesting, provocative, funniest, and strangest. Feel free to throw anything in there just to kind of keep them on their toes. Is there something you've always wanted to know about Imam Mansour or, for example, Mehdi? Now is your chance to ask that question because I will make sure to read it out loud. Yeah. So, how's everyone doing? Good. It took me 2 hours to get here from the airport, which is as long as it took me to fly here. So that is Generation Rise on an American scale. The purpose of tonight's conversation is to basically talk about the issues, dilemmas, opportunities, and challenges that are facing Muslim communities going forward. And so what I'm going to do basically is start the conversation off by introducing Mehdi right here to my left, who many of you may have seen or heard. Mehdi is the political director of Huffington Post UK. He's a columnist for the New Statesman magazine and the presenter of Head to Head on Al Jazeera English. If you have not seen it, you definitely should. He is a biographer of British opposition leader Ed Miliband and has published an electronic book on the financial crisis. In 2012, in the Guardian newspaper, Mehdi wrote, "The British Muslim community has had a tortured relationship with politicians in recent years. That it has become a cliche to say that young British Muslims are alienated, estranged, and marginalized from the political process doesn't make it any less true. Muslims are woefully underrepresented in political life. The number of Muslim members of parliament in the UK, for instance, stands at 8 out of 650. Now, that was about 2 years ago, but what I wanted to ask Mehdi to start with is, when we are constantly as a community being tagged by events abroad overseas, for example, most recently, the rise of ISIS, how do we as a community focus on the domestic when there is so much pressure on us to talk about the so-called foreign?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Lovely to be here in Detroit. Thank you very much, Harun, for that very kind introduction. Lovely to be on such a distinguished panel. In answer to your not provocative question at all, I would say, what a way to start. I'll start by berating my fellow Muslims. No, look, my view is very clear. I don't think we should force a choice when it comes to discussing issues that matter. And what's interesting is we have this ISNA 3-day event. I'm looking at the program. Those of you who have looked at your programs, should I get closer? Okay. I won't start again. Look, I don't think we should have to choose between foreign subjects and domestic subjects. If you look at your programs, you'll see ISNA's put together an amazing range of panel events over the next couple of days. I want to go to all of them, but obviously you can't. And there's so many issues that we can cover, should cover, have the ability and intellect to cover, have the expertise within our community to cover. And I just don't buy this false choice that so many people in our communities, both in the UK, where I live, in Europe, and here in North America, which is, well, you know, we've got to have this debate about Gaza and nothing else, or about Iraq and nothing else. We've got to go on the media only to talk about ISIS and terrorism and radicalization. Look, take it from me. I'm a journalist who happens to be a Muslim. I can assure you, when I started out, the only thing people wanted to talk to me about were these issues, not just domestic versus foreign, but Islamic issues in general. And now, you know, I'm the guy who then went and wrote, as you said, I wrote a biography of the leader of the opposition, Ed Miliband. People are like, why'd you write a book about him? He's not going to be prime minister. Well, we'll see next year. But separately, I kind of, you know, the first book I was going to write was not going to be a book about Islam because it's so easy to get pigeonholed. To take directly your question, I wrote this column in 2012 when George Galloway was elected as Member of Parliament in Bradford. Some of you may know George Galloway, the British MP. And my point was that Muslims cannot keep going back to the ballot box and voting basically only on the basis of foreign policy issues, only on the basis of which war is current right now. That doesn't mean that foreign policy isn't important. Of course not. It is. Take it from someone like me. You know, you want to talk about Palestinians. I spent the last month arguing with various supporters of Israel about Gaza. I've been on radio shows with the Israeli ambassador to the UK. You want to talk about Iraq. I've written several columns about ISIS. You know, I'm at Iraq and Iraq. You want to talk about Hans Blix, WMD, Yellow Cake from Niger. Let's go right now. We could, refight the 2003 Iraq invasion. But you know what? You can, what's the phrase? You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can do both. You can also focus on issues at home that matter, issues in our community that matter, whether it's, the high rates of Muslim in prison, whether it's the number of Muslims who are disproportionately represented amongst mental health cases in the UK, for example, whether it's issues to do with drugs and sex and all of those other issues that the previous session was touching upon here. I just don't buy this false division between we must talk about foreign policy because Muslims are dying, the Ummah matters, and people who want to talk about domestic politics, they're self-indulgent, they're middle class, they don't care about their fellow Muslims abroad, they're focusing on things that don't matter when people are dying now. Yes, people are dying, but that doesn't mean that other issues aren't important. And actually, not just from a moral perspective, but from a self-serving purpose. If we focus on issues at home and are a better community at home, a more prosperous, more stable, more united, more politically effective community at home, we can actually do much more to help on those causes abroad that matter to us.
Thank you. To my right, we have Zara Bilou, who is a community organizer, civil rights attorney. Many of you have seen her eloquently defending Muslim civil rights and civil rights more generally in the United States and abroad. She serves as the executive director of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is one of the most notable Muslim organizations that we have in the United States. And I wanted to ask you, the last few years have seen some really intense debates and conversations in a lot of Muslim communities about where we stand as a country domestically and internationally. And sometimes these conversations, building off of what Mehdi said, can become kind of intense, and they provoke sharp divisions and disagreements. Now, there's nothing to say that we as a community have to agree on where we stand, but how do we deal with the divisions in our community that are inevitably going to keep coming up as these conversations, especially involving Muslims, become more and more pointed, more heated?
Also not on. Jazakallah khair. Thank you to Harun, to everyone else on the panel, and to ISNA for having this conversation. It's always difficult to talk about disagreements and then to give us all the stage and hope that we won't do it wrong. We build together over and over. One of the things that my parents always raised me with is you fight more with your siblings than you will fight with anyone in your life. And then maybe when you get married, you fight a little bit with your spouse, but never the way you fight with your siblings. And you can't rid yourself of your siblings or your parents. They're your family. Our community is one family. And one of the things that I remember post 9/11 that we talked about a lot was unity and unity and unity. And every time there was disagreement, people got worried and they got scared. Except we have to realize that unity does not mean uniformity. We're going to disagree. We have to draw our lines in the sand. For some people, that's going to be boycott, divestment, sanctions. For some people, it's going to be gender relations. I'll tell you personally, I have trouble working with people who disrespect women. I have trouble being in separate spaces. I have trouble not seeing the imam. And so when I'm put in those spaces, my personal lines are tested, right? And everyone has those. But I come back over and over. I was raised to go to the masjid every day of the week, and I'm grateful that I still get to do that. And I don't always agree, but we're stronger together. One of the things that's really easy to do is to fall apart, right? How easy would it be to splinter this group in this room into 15 different conventions? We could probably find more ways to divide us. But the former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, doesn't come speak to a convention of 50 Muslims. He comes and he speaks to ISNA because we have power when we mobilize together. And so I say, fight, put your opinions out there, work within the organizations and the institutions to put forward your agenda. but also understand that unity is going to mean more than any divisions that we ever have. And so if we don't have the discipline to fall in line when it's necessary to fall in line, when it's necessary to mobilize thousands and really millions of Muslims, when you think about even how big this group is, take a second and think, actually, there's somewhat around 7 million Muslims in the United States. If you could move 7 million Muslims, we could probably fix our foreign policy and our domestic policy. But it takes discipline, teamwork, and unity first.
Thank you. Oh, it's not working. I was using the broken mic because I'm very smart. That was a joke. Nobody laughed. Like, that's great. He's really not smart. It's still very early, right? You know, was it the long cab ride? Nothing, man. I'm getting nothing here. It's really terrible. I'm so sorry. I feel really bad. You know, it's bad enough I'm not a doctor. So there's nothing wrong if you're not a doctor. Your kids can pay for school themselves. It's true. So on my far right, Imam Mansour Sabri, who I believe we met the first time in West Virginia. In West Virginia, which is not where I expected to meet. The resident imam, a community activist of the largest African-American Muslim community in the United States. He's based in Atlanta, Georgia area. If you don't know him, you should know him. And I wanted to ask you, we have a lot of big conversations, but you're the imam of a very large, very significant, very historic community. What are the issues you see on the ground? What are the conversations you think we should be having up here?
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. Again, it's an honor to be here on stage with this distinguished panel and discussing some very heavy issues, big topics. And just to briefly comment on what has been said, I think for me personally and for a segment of the Muslim community, it's very difficult or challenging sometimes to speak about international affairs when our concerns are very domestic. I read a report recently done by an ISNA research group, Ihsan Bagby, just noting that 36% of the Muslim community in America is made up of African Americans, those who converted over the first and second generation. Me personally, I'm a second generation Muslim. My parents converted my father in the late 60s, my mother in the 70s. And it's a large segment of people who are not necessarily over-concerned about global issues in the degree in which we have dialogue and conversation, so it's good to kind of have this mix. And so for us, it becomes staying balanced with engaging and understanding the global position and understanding the Muslim world and how it affects us with this shrinking table that we all sit at as human beings. But I always pose the question, when we have this large segment of Muslims in America who changed their religion, who converted, we should be asking what decision-making process took place? Why did they come to the fold of al-Islam and continue to kind of use that as a way to have meaningful dialogue and conversation as citizens of this country? Because as a faith, it's something that really engages all types of people. And the diversity that comes with al-Islam historically, within our seerah, within the formation of the first community in Medina, we have a replica of that here in America that's profound and unique, that's unseen throughout the world. And so just kind of calling on that strength and allowing for what we're going through as a people to kind of dictate what the top priorities are. I'm an imam. That means that I get abused a lot. Used quite a bit. But as imams, we put ourselves in that position to be servants to society. So when I think about really, just to kind of be brief with it, when I think about really why so many people chose al-Islam as their way, from the African American community in particular, it was because Islam presented a solution to a problem. And to be leaders in today's society, we have to think about it that way. What type of problem is in existence, and how can we pose a suitable, responsible solution for it? And by default, you become the one who's foremost. You become the one who's out front. You become the one who's leading. But it's not sitting back and having conversations about it, but it's really about being active. So a lot of the work we do is in community development and seeing the problems daily, seeing the issues that come in through the door from community members who are Muslim and even those who are just neighbors who need assistance. We begin to think about as a Muslim from our source, from the Quran, from the tradition of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how do we formulate new ideas and new solutions for current everyday problems? And that, believe me, brings new Muslims into the fold.
And on my left here, we have Mariam Amir Ibrahimji. We actually shared a cab ride here, and I got to hear her speak quite eloquently and passionately about social justice and what's going on in the United States today. I'm sure everyone has seen and been, I think, dismayed, concerned, heartbroken, frustrated by what's happening in Ferguson and the larger patterns and trends it speaks to. Sometimes it feels to me that we don't necessarily see things until they pop up on a certain kind of radar, right? Things are fine if they're in the background and then they blow open and suddenly many people ask ourselves, did we really have a problem that big that we didn't see? And Mariam is working towards her bachelor's in Islamic sciences through Al-Azhar University. So she's a scholar of Islam. She's, as I said, passionate about social justice. She's a hafiza, which means she's memorized the Quran, the Muslim scripture. And so I wanted to ask you, in the work that you do, what are the conversations that we're not having? Imam Mansour spoke about how different communities have different attachments to Islam. And what I'm wondering conversely is, what are the things perhaps we're not talking about that could lead to the opposite? To people perhaps drifting away from the community or even from Islam itself?
Okay, let me actually ask all of you a question. Raise your hand if you know someone who has dealt with depression in the Muslim community. Raise your hand. Everyone take a quick look around, see how many hands there are. Okay, hands down. Depression or isolation to the point of actually attempting suicide or cutting or other forms of self-harm. Raise your hand. Look around. That's a lot of people raising their hand. Hands down. How many of you know or have personally experienced racism in the Muslim community? Okay, look around. Look around. Hands down. As women, how many of you have felt like you don't have a space in the Muslim community? Don't raise your hand. Okay. As men, how many of you feel like you have issues that can't actually be addressed in the Muslim community? Okay. You can't raise your hand because you can't be addressed, so that was a trick question. Why did you raise your hand? Those are broad issues. But in our community, we deal with people who leave Islam completely, and it's not because Islam isn't this incredible religion. It's because our communities don't have relevant conversations about what people are actually going through. And some of these issues may start young, may start in a person's home life, but as you continue and deal with the type of segregation, the type of sexism, the racism, and a lot of the phobias that we have in our community, it causes people to start feeling inadequate as individuals. And it causes us to feel like we can't even be a part of a spiritual space that's supposed to help us feel closer to the one who created us. And when that connection is lost, it's very difficult for us to continue to feel passionate about issues that have to do with humanitarianism or political issues when we feel so broken. So one of the things that I've seen in the work that I've been doing in different communities is that people are so in pain, in so much pain, because, for example, a brother who told me he's an African-American convert, he's been Muslim for almost 10 years. He told me that black is the wrong color to be in the Muslim community. Another young person, a high school student, came up to me after a lecture, and she told me that it was the first time in her life that she felt like God actually loved her. She thought that God hated her her entire life because in her family, she's got problems. Her mom is constantly telling her there's no point in you praying because God isn't going to accept it anyway since I'm always upset with you. And many young people have told me they've heard that from their parents before. Then they go into the masjid, and there's no real tangible space in the masjid sometimes for young people. Then they go to school, and the people, for example, who embraced this sister were individuals who were very, very strongly involved with drugs, and she got involved with drugs, and eventually she attempted suicide. But why did that even happen? Because she was trying to fill a void that wasn't filled within our community. So one of the things that I think I appreciate about every individual here who do a lot of work for building the community is that they follow a particular example, and this is something that I think we need to keep in mind. Asma bint Umays, she was a female companion of the Prophet, peace be upon Prophet Muhammad. She converted to Islam. She migrated to Abyssinia, then migrated back to Medina. Now this is 7 years after the migration of the Prophet, peace be upon him. She's coming in late. How many of you guys are converts? Raise your hands. Hi, hi, hi. May God bless every single one of you and every single one of your family members. Ameen. How many of you came to Islam later on in life? Okay. And how many of you have ever felt like you're inferior to someone else who's Muslim because they've made you feel that way? That's happened to me many times. Now, Asma, she comes in 7 years after being in Abyssinia. She's visiting the daughter of Umar, who Sunni Muslims revere highly. Umar walks in and he's like, who's she? And Hafsa, his daughter, is like, oh, you know, that's Asma bint Umayy. So he's like, oh, she's the one who made the hijrah. And you know what he told her? He was like, we got to Medina first. We got here first. So we have more of a right to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, than you do. In other words, we're Sunnis. We're the majority of the Muslim community. We have more of a right to Muslim spaces than you do. We wear hijab. You don't. We have more of a right to Muslim spaces than you do. We're born Muslims. You're not. We have more of a right to Muslim spaces than you do. We're Arab. You're everything else. We have more of a right to Muslim spaces than you do. We hear these discussions in the community constantly, but what did Asma do? She used her agency of voice. And one thing that all of these individuals are doing, and I'm sure many of you are doing, and this is what they alluded to, is that she didn't just sit there and go, you're right, I'm a woman, I'm inferior, I have nothing to say. She was like, by God, I swear you're wrong. And I'm not gonna eat, I'm not gonna drink until I go to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and tell him what you said. I'm gonna tell it like it is. When she told the Prophet, peace be upon him, you know what he told her? He didn't say cover your face, leave. Even though, excuse me, I don't mean to say cover your face in an oppressive way. Many women choose to do that, may God bless them. But sometimes that is the way that we treat women who have something very important to say about the dynamics of our community. The Prophet ﷺ, instead, he told her, Umar doesn't have more of a right to me than you, nor do his companions. Oh, kama qal. What he told her is that you and your companions migrated twice, and they only migrated once, so the reward is more for them. When she used her agency of voice, she not only affected herself, but she empowered the rest of the community of people who came later. The reason I wanted to focus on this really quickly is because we have the collective ability, like Zahra mentioned, to focus on all these other areas, like Mehdi mentioned. But we need to make sure that we as a community feel like we can voice the issues that we're dealing with, and that we feel comfortable having the agency of doing that, so that we can go into a community like Imam Mansour's as a convert or somebody who feels like historically we've been oppressed in this country, and we can say that we have issues we need to focus on that span beyond what fills our Facebook feeds every few weeks and then changes, when people are dying inside. So the point is, Asma used her agency of voice, and every single one of us has that ability.
I just wanted to pick up on that, very spot on every word that you said. I agree with that. I just want to pick up on a couple of things. One is, I think, one of the reasons the behavior you identify, and feel free to disagree, is I think there's a lot of laziness in our community. Not just physically lazy, although we are physically lazy, and I include myself in that, but intellectually lazy. And I think we get to this point where we say, I used the phrase earlier, walking and chewing gum at the same time. This idea that, people, I'm sure many of you are listening right now, and you would have heard, as I did, such a passionate statement about depression and about self-harm. And a lot of you might say, well, we can't be everywhere at once. We can't all deal with these issues. I don't have the expertise, but I can go and protest about something that's happening abroad. And I think we are too comfortable. We are in a comfort zone. And one of the reasons for that is because, people say, oh, the Middle East, it's complicated. I think in our minds, it's not complicated at all. I think there's an identifiable set of baddies. There's an identifiable set of solutions. We're on the side of the good guys. And therefore, it's very easy to take a stance, speak out vocally, join groups, go on protests. And when there's more complicated or complex or nuanced or slightly less glamorous discussions to be had at home, or protests to take part in our universities or our workplaces or our community, then it's kind of like, well, I haven't got time. I went to that protest last week on Iraq or Gaza or whatever it was. I can't go on this protest about climate change or about housing or about education or healthcare. And it really bothers me because that's laziness. There's no reason why we can't do more than one thing. We have plenty of time, which we choose to waste and abuse. And, I took part in a rally against austerity in 2011, a year after the British Conservative-led government came in and brought in unprecedented spending cuts. I took part in a rally. I was on stage at Hyde Park 250,000 people marched against austerity in 2011 in the UK. And I'm not saying Muslims are only people who wear hijabs or beards, but I would take that as my rough indicator. Looking at the crowd, there were not many Muslim faces that I could see from my vantage point in Hyde Park. The same park where Muslims have gathered to protest against the invasion of Iraq, to protest against the Israeli bombing of Gaza, to protest against Danish cartoons of the Prophet. You draw a cartoon, Muslims will do a protest. But you're about to lose your job or your livelihood. You know, British Pakistani and British Bangladeshi communities are amongst the most deprived communities in the UK. They're some of the communities hardest hit by government economic policies, by austerity, by spending cuts. And yet, where are the Muslims on these struggles, on these battles at home, which affect our daily lives and struggles? And one last point, just because something Zara said about, you were talking about siblings, and about how you never fight with anyone as you do with a sibling. Here. Hope my sister's not watching. The problem with that analogy is that sometimes I look at our community, and again, feel free to disagree, I don't think we do behave as a family at all. I think there's very little evidence for that suggestion. Perhaps sections of the community do, but sections certainly don't. And I give the example of those of us and those of us on this platform, those of you here, who have taken an unpopular stance, who have taken a stance that the majority hasn't agreed with. I can only speak for myself, but we don't feel like a member of the family when you take that stance. You know, no, it doesn't matter how much credit you have in your bank account, it doesn't matter how much good work you've done. There's a lot of suspicion in our community. There's a lot of lack of trust, which most families, of course, do have trust. No matter how bad your son or daughter is, you will always still give your life for them, you'll still trust them. And unfortunately, in our community, you know, you have this issue now. I'll give you one example from my own life. Here you go, let's make myself. I've written, 20, 30, 40 articles, columns, blogs about Israel's oppression of Gaza. I'm accused by people who support Israel of being obsessed with Palestine, etc., etc. I write one column about anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. Suddenly all the comments are, Mehdi, you sold out. Mehdi, you secret Zionist. Mehdi, what are you doing for your career? What are you doing you want to be popular in these people's circles? Doesn't matter what you've done previously. If you write anything that doesn't follow the party line on Israel, you're a secret Zionist. You go to a White House iftar, controversial subject, I believe, in the US recently. You might as well be flying the drone itself that dropped the bomb on Pakistani children. I mean, this is the level sometimes of the discourse in our community, which is one perceived bad deed, even if it's not a bad deed, cancels out everything else. And we're suspicious of the motivations of those of us who are on the same journey. You know, we talk about Sirat al-Mustaqim. Yes, the right path is pretty broad and capacious in my view. You can be on that path and heading in the same direction as everyone else, but doing your struggle in a different way. You can be a doctor or engineer. You can be a politician or a journalist. You can be an imam or an academic. You can take a more engaged stance. You can take a more disengaged stance. But the idea that you can suddenly turn to your fellow Muslim and say, aha, you're not doing it my way, therefore you're a sellout, therefore you're a failure, therefore you've left the community. That is a huge problem in our community, and that's what prevents us from being the family we should be.
So I'm not personally attached to the example, so I don't mind that you attacked it. But I will say, families go to counseling, Mehdi. Yes. So if this isn't where we work it out, and not you and me, but like the community, like families go to counseling. They have fights. They don't invite people to weddings. Like, they hash it out. They disagree, but they are still family. Those are bonds that can't be broken. And so I agree, the family isn't there. It's had some rough years, right? Like, money's difficult, people intermarried, like some people are Sunni, some people are Shia, some people want to have an iftar at the White House, and others of us don't think that's the best idea. But in the end, we're family. And if we're not talking about the issues, if we're not fighting about the issues, then they're sort of under the rug, and that's worse, right?
I agree with you. Sorry, I haven't got a microphone.
Yeah, that's okay.
I agree with that. I agree with that point, but let's not be under any illusions. The people who are here at ISNA and the people in this crowd and the people who have paid money to come to this convention, mashallah, good for all of you, are not the same as the community out there. There are many people out there, unfortunately, fellow Muslim brothers and sisters of ours, who aren't interested in going to counseling, who just want to be negative, unfortunately, and destructive. and only want to take the simple stances, the easy stances, the black and white stances, the comfortable stances. And I'm not sure, and if we're going to hear from the audience, I'd love to hear ideas about how we get to those people, how we win over those people, because I'm reaching this point maybe because I'm in a particular space that and in the space I occupy, you have to have a bit of a thick skin when it comes to, and I always thought I would have to have that thick skin to deal with non-Muslims, to deal with opponents, to deal with people who are attacking me for my ideological views of being a Muslim. And in recent years, I found actually I need that thicker skin for people in my own community more, which is a pretty depressing realization.
Sure. So the hardest thing for me about wearing hijab growing up was that I had the most insults and the most questions from the Muslim community. So I get it. We have to have thicker skin in our community. The last thing on the family example is when we talk about marriage counseling and family counseling, one of the things we run into is that many people don't even know that counseling resources exist. So for me, when I landed at the Detroit airport and I was really excited that the person at the coffee shop was Arab and wanted to talk to me about my flight and all of that, he didn't know what ISNA is. So he had no idea why I was here. And granted, I came in, I think, a couple of days, some time before the convention, but there's also some work that needs to be done about going wide, about making sure that those 7 million Muslims know about the community, know where their local mosque is, know what resources exist. The thing I wanted to touch on is, I think a lot of times we talk about this as talking versus doing, about one protest versus another protest, and I don't know that that works. It's got to be a lifestyle. So looking at, using myself as an example, I don't know if the airline I flew in on had union staff. And I didn't check to see if the hotel staff at the place I'm staying are union. And I don't know if I tipped as generously as I could have when I had my food. And did I greet everyone with a smile, recognizing that I'm an ambassador of Islam when I'm out in the street? Do I care about what I'm buying? Did everyone download the Boycott app after the recent Gaza attack? Did anyone download it? The one that helps you figure out what you're buying? A few of you. How many of us are actually using it, right? So it's not just did you go to a protest. One would argue that protests are just one method of achieving change, and alone, like any other method, are absolutely ineffective. So if that's all we're doing, then that's not enough. Talking is important too. One of the things that we said in the Bay Area when the recent attack happened in Gaza was that it's not enough to share it on Facebook or to talk to your family and friends about it, or even to hold a town hall about the issues at the mosque. You have to be talking to people at the grocery store, at work, at school about these issues and other issues. The other thing that I'll say is, it sounds really terrible to say, but there is as Mahdi said, a self-serving reason to care about the other issues. I could say that we should all agree that our religion calls us to work for justice, and that working for justice is itself an act of worship, and that issues of injustice are everywhere. You don't have to fly to Palestine or Pakistan or even the White House to find those. Those are in our own community. And so there is a religiously motivated reason to work for it. But Mahdi said this, and I think it's worth just reiterating over and over and over again, is that when we're working on other issues that affect other communities, sometimes not even our own, but I think there's a let's be real about what affects us. And things like poverty, things like the mortgage crisis, those things affect our community too. We're just not talking about it because those people can't afford to come to conventions, right? So whether it's an issue that affects me or doesn't, I have a religiously motivated reason to work on it. But I also have a selfish reason. All of the issues that I think I should care about, like Palestine, like the drones, like building a mosque, I'm going to be more effective at mobilizing allies for those issues, at garnering empathy for those issues if I was there. How many of us expect our neighbors to come to our mosque when we have an open house? A lot of us. If I send you an invitation to an open house at my mosque, I really want you to come. How many of us are willing to go to the synagogues, to the temples, to the churches, to say we're also here to stand with you? That it was even an issue about whether or not Muslims should stand for Ferguson is itself telling, right? That should have been an automatic thing for us to do.
Sure, go ahead.
Very briefly, before that point goes, so I'm not hogging the mic, I don't even have one. Very briefly, just to pick up on that, in the UK, there was an interfaith gathering between a local mosque and a synagogue where they had, people came and there were events, etc., and then it stopped. And I said to one of the organizers, why has it stopped? And he said, because the Jews always came to our mosque, but none of us would go to the synagogue. Oh, wow. And that's what we do with interfaith events, unfortunately. We want it all for us and for our benefits and our causes. Are we there for their causes? That's an absolutely superb point.
Excellent. I think there's a lot of positive things happening in our community, and there are a lot of different people involved in different things. But our challenge is we try to capture all of it under the umbrella of this is the Muslim community, or this is the effort of this organization, et cetera, when we have to just live as human beings and get engaged in the things that matter to us. Sometimes when we live in a society that kind of chops us up into different segments of society, which religion you're a part of, what race you're a part of, what generation you're a part of, we're falling victim to that same type of thinking and not understanding that everything that the human being does has to be called upon by his inner faith and belief that God has chosen you for this mission, for this purpose, for this idea, and that he's guiding you every day constantly, regardless of your gender, your race, your generation that you're a part of. Get involved where things matter. And that's how we have to kind of look at the life of the human being, is that when you get involved in something that matters, you're going to make a difference, and you should believe in making that difference. Ferguson was not a question for me. It's a civil rights issue. It's a human rights issue. And then as an African American, I saw it very close to home as a nephew issue or as a young brother issue that I see every day. As you all don't live in the South of America. It's a little different than in the northern cities. And it's a real challenge. Race issues still exist, and they still matter. So where things matter, Muslims should be involved. Where things matter, Muslims should be involved.
So I had a personal reflection on the flight over, largely because I don't actually fit on planes, so can't really sleep or relax. And I don't actually know how a plane flies if I can't stand up in it. I don't understand physics. That's why I'm here and don't have a real job. But one thing I was thinking about was, here we are again going to war with Iraq. And it brought me back, as Matthew pointed out, to 2003. And it was an interesting time in my life. And I promise it'll all make sense. 2003, I graduated from college. I thought I was going to go to law school. I went to law school, and I was unbelievably miserable. I absolutely detested and loathed law school. Nothing against lawyers, but it was not for me. We all love law school. But in my blinkered view of the world, there were only two career options. Either you're a doctor or you're a lawyer. And it sounds ridiculous now, but this is what I honestly thought. And I thought to myself, if I don't become a doctor and I don't become a lawyer, I'm going to become nothing. Could be an accountant, yes, that's true. I didn't even know that option existed. Also, as previously said, I can't count either, so that wasn't an option. And I remember feeling very profoundly like a personal failure. And at the same time, I was kind of a street activist, right? Please don't look me up on Google before 2003. I was also a lot heavier. Doesn't make any sense. But we were organizing these protests against the Iraq War, and tens of thousands of people were coming out, and it appeared to have made absolutely no difference. Right? All those people came onto the streets and nothing happened. The war went ahead. It was a terrible idea, and it turned out to be even more of a terrible idea. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I want to ask each of you, how has failure in any respect shaped your life and your career? Because I think sometimes we have a discourse in a lot of communities, right, where we talk about achievements and success, and we don't talk about how we deal with when things don't go our way, and how sometimes, sort of as we heard, when things don't go our way, there are opportunities for us we don't see. And I wish, when I was in that age bracket and point in my life, so to speak, that I had heard that there was perhaps value to not getting what I wanted and to seeing things not work out, because it showed me things about myself I didn't understand. So I wanted to start with Miriam and ask you, what got you here? What are the experiences that you wish you could share with people? And this is called Generation Rise, right? So what do we have to share with people out there? What do we wish they knew about us or knew about themselves?
I came from a family where many of my family members converted to Islam. So when my parents were raising me, Islam was a part of my identity, but I didn't connect to that, and I didn't want to be that. So it wasn't until later on when I started reading the Quran in the English translation after a spiritual experience that I actually started wanting to take on being Muslim, and I wanted to live it. That was so exciting, and I'm a very passionate person. I was the president of my student body council. I was involved with local politics. I was so excited about now sharing with everyone how awesome Muslim women are, since now I'm a real Muslim woman, because I identify as that. But the more that I learned about Islam and my super excitement to become a real understanding Muslim, I started doubting my faith because of what I learned about women's rights and roles. And I want to clarify what that means. I had individuals who thought that they knew religion tell me that women shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that, shouldn't be involved with this. Me up here, never. The way that I speak loudly, no. My personality entirely, I thought, was a test from God himself, because he was trying to see whether or not I could keep quiet when he's naturally made me this way. And that caused me to really doubt, is this really the religion that I want to be a part of? And I know many women have experienced that as well. One of the things that helped me through that, even though it was very painful and it took many years to get out of it, was that I started recognizing that the reason I felt this way was because sometimes in our communities, we put people in positions of power who are not educated and not able to be relevant to be there. Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi talks about in his introduction to Tahrir al-Mar'ah, it's a book that talks about the liberation of women in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. He talks about two of the reasons that we have issues in the Muslim community when it comes to women that didn't exist during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. One of them is that we have a misapplication of our textual evidences. So we use something and we say, women shouldn't do this because of this hadith. But when you really look at that hadith, that's not at all what that's supposed to mean. The second is having a bad assumption. So sometimes a scholar may be a scholar of hadith, but he's not a scholar in fiqh. A scholar may be a scholar in Quran, but she's not a scholar in another area. But we take from the wrong people who don't necessarily understand our situation here. So one of the reasons that I felt the most difficult time period in my life, which was trying to figure out whether or not I really wanted to assert my Islamic identity, was finding what Islam really is. And it is an incredibly empowering, incredibly liberating, and incredibly socially just life movement. For me, Islam changed my life in the most incredible way after I went through the pain of thinking that I lived what Islam really wanted from me. So in one aspect, my experiences in trying to become scholarly caused me so much pain and so much rift in my personality, in my relationships, and in my religion. But that also helped me understand that Islam is relevant. It relates to all of these issues that we're talking about. And that Allah loves every single person in this room, or the people that he's created, anyone who thinks about him, and people who don't even know that they want to think about him. He is not far from us. God is not far from us. But our community makes us feel that God is far from us. The second thing that really affected me in my life was that in middle school, I went to a suburban school in the suburbs. In high school, I went to school in the inner city. And I saw the differences in the resources and in the consequences of what happened to a lot of my peers when I look at the tracks of life and the opportunities that both were given. So when I did my master's at UCLA in social justice education. I focused on critical race studies for students of color in urban cities. What that basically meant is that on a personal level, my life revolved around understanding what it's like to be in an area that policies of the United States keep in poverty, even in education. On the second level, on a research level, I'm working with students now looking at research on policies that affect the way we continue to put communities of color in particular spaces. So for example, when Ferguson happened, I was so angry, yes, at everything that's going on, but also at our reaction as a Muslim community. I cannot believe that we actually had questioned why we should be involved with speaking up about what's going on and with being allies to our brothers and sisters in Ferguson regardless of faith. But somebody who I make dua for, and I ask Allah to give him the highest paradise, his name is Kunta Kinte. He was somebody who was a free man who was brought here from Africa enslaved, and listening to his life and the experiences that he went through, being ripped from his family, and the types of things that he had to go through being ripped from the family he then made here. This is not one person's story. This is the reality of so many of our beautiful brothers and sisters who were brought here who were taken as free people and enslaved. And then that historically affects policies today. This isn't history. This is affecting communities today. So for me, the two biggest things that affected my life and the things that I'm involved with right now is one, recognizing how painful it is when Islam is taught at the hands of individuals who may be very well intentioned, but really, unfortunately, do not truly completely understand the text and their relevancy in our place and time today. And the second part is being a part of living and loving individuals from different communities, experiencing what it's like to have education on both sides, and then understanding that the people who shaped our country today were individuals now who live on reservation camps, are individuals who live in areas that are historically and systemically oppressed, and are individuals who we do not constantly talk about and represent in our own discussions. Many of us have felt isolated in our community, and I've felt isolated as well, and I continue to feel isolated. And I, alhamdulillah, have memorized the Quran. And alhamdulillah, I'm starting to be a scholar, and I feel isolated. How many other people who have no space can't come to a conference like this because they don't feel like they're ever going to be welcomed? They don't feel like they're going to have a space where they can feel supported, and that's not what the Prophet ﷺ taught. One thing I want to talk about really to finish this is that for me, through those processes, I learned about individual responsibility, because all of this is overwhelming. Politics, seeing people die, seeing all those images, it's so overwhelming and you feel like you can't really take it all on. But the Prophet ﷺ taught personal responsibility, and this is something I love. Al-Fadl, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, was one time riding with him, and a woman walked up, and she was, mashallah, she's like a hottie. So Al-Fadl, he's checking her out. And the Prophet ﷺ, he's like noticing that his young bro is checking out this girl. Now, in this case, he could have told her, turn around, he's looking at you. He could have told her, leave, go ask some guy you're related to come ask the question. But what he did is he taught Al-Fadl personal responsibility. He turned his cheek. He didn't shame him, he didn't blame him, he didn't shame her or blame her. He just taught him that when he recognizes that there's something going on internally, just take a moment, take personal responsibility, and do some type of action that you have control over. And for me, I don't have control over everything that's going on, and I'm overwhelmed oftentimes. But then I think about, what can I control? I've been in pain because of the things I've mentioned, and all of you have been in pain because of other issues. So what things can you actually control in your life? And like my dad says, whenever there's a problem, it's not something to be super sad about, it's a time to get excited. So what things can you do personally to take responsibility over the problems that you have?
Alhamdulillah. Very, very powerful, profound, Sister Maryam. Thank you for that. Those are just passionate ideas that I think touch all of us. And when I think about just those who've come before, we all have stories. We all have family stories. We have community stories. We have things that really touch us in terms of those who came before and really made the sacrifice for us to be here today. And I would have to say that when I look prophetically at the life of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I see someone driven to respond to his Lord regardless of the conditions or circumstances that will be brought on him. And I see that as she talked about Kunta Kinte, which is very historic for the African American community, tied to Alex Haley's history, great author and journalist here in the United States. He traced his family back to him being Muslim and surviving throughout all of the odds to remain faithful, to know that God is still in control regardless of the condition that you may be in. And I think that's profound. I think about four particular people I'm going to talk about too. One is Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. Raise your hand if you know who I'm talking about. You and millions of others throughout the world know this figure. And they know him because he stood for his principles. He stood for his beliefs. And something very profound that here in Atlanta, one of the secretaries at the masjid was Malcolm's secretary. She's a pioneer. May Allah preserve her. May Allah bless her. But one day I was talking with her and she shared a story with me. And just to be brief with it, I said, how was Malcolm beyond the rostrum? How was he outside of the public face? And she said, he was the most righteous man that I knew. He was a man who was consistent with his principles. And when I heard that, I think about the politicians, those who have to be before the microphone, those who have to speak for all, those who have to champion these causes. And are they the same behind closed doors? Are they ones who are charged with this belief, this faith, that says that God is watchful at all times, not just when the news comes on? And that are you consistent with your challenge? Are you consistent with how you respond to your challenge? And so that always touched me to really be a person of balance and judge myself as it relates to very serious issues that come about in the community. Usually when I work in interfaith circles, I get the question, am I Sunni? I get the question, am I Shia? As a convert, as an African American, which group will they place me in at that point? And my response is always, I'm a practical Muslim. I'm a Muslim. I look at the life that God prescribes for us through the Quran, and then I look at the life in which God sent as an example, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and extract those principles that will influence everyone's day in life. So when I think about the Muslim community in many instances, I really see a group of people who are culturally tied to a religion that has no full bearing on culture at all. That we're misinformed. We're not fully educated about the better way that I like to look at Prophet Muhammad's sunnah is thinking of the word uswa. And the uswa is a way. It doesn't look the same. It doesn't have the same characteristics of what type of clothing or what type of language or talk or cultural habits. It has a way of getting to truth, a way of getting to the heart of the matter, a way of seeing the problem to seeing the solution to a problem. And so the uswa of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam also touched the life of Muhammad Ali. Raise your hand if you know Muhammad Ali. You know, I've been to 8 different Muslim countries, 9 actually, and every time I arrive at the airport, I get the question of, after they see my passport with the eagle on it, they say, and they see my name, Mansour Hamdi Ibn Sabri, they say, well, where are you really from? And I say, well, I'm from the United States. I said, no, where's your father from? You all know the series of questions. No, where's your father's father from? I said, well, everyone from the U.S. is from somewhere else, if that's what you mean. They say, no, you're Muslim. I said, do you know who Muhammad Ali is? And 100%, everyone I've talked to say, yes, Muhammad Ali Clyde. They do this. I said, well, he's my uncle. They say, oh, you're American Muslim. And it clicks instantly because he's a figure that transcends kind of this understanding of boxes for Muslims. And the reality of his story is courage. His greatest fight was with the Supreme Court. His greatest fight was standing for his beliefs in his religion. And we make dua for Muhammad Ali, who's still alive, who's still fighting a good fight. He has Parkinson's in Arizona. We make dua for him that Allah preserve him and continue his message of truth and standing firm out for justice, even when it's against his own self. And when you look at his story very closely, he corrects the idea of being the greatest. He says, only God is the greatest. I'm just trying to live up to the potential he placed in me. So these are figures that we can call on and really come to understand the narrative that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in these figures who say that they are Muslim and that they are standing for the principles of al-Islam. They have touched my heart. The other two, just by mentioning Julaylib, which is a Sahaba, and Bilal radiallahu anhu, when you look at their stories, you really kind of see a passion around Islam being inclusive and measuring people based on based upon their character and not on the color of their skin or their social stability, but really looking at the heart of the matter of what are you contributing to society and what has Allah sent you for. So may Allah bless us as an ummah and as a community to keep striving for the best in this life and make sure that we receive, inshallah, the best of the hereafter. Ameen.
So I've struggled with this question about failures and challenges a lot, and I don't want to repeat what's been said, but there are 2 things that are coming to mind for me now. The first is I try not to see failures as failures. I try to see them as tests from Allah and also opportunities. And that's true for whatever the test or opportunity is, that even the negative is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to make use of the resources. It's an opportunity to grow stronger. It's an opportunity to learn. And then the second thing that I don't know if it's been said yet is surrounding ourselves with the right people. Is that every test, whether it is how do we deal with international issues, how do we deal with depression, how do we deal with marital problems, any of those things, those are all addressed so well when we're surrounded by the right people. That means families and parents that have open and communicative relationships with their children. That means religious leaders who are qualified to be religious leaders, but also who are aware of their limitations. It means organizations that are strong and thriving and funded and resourced. And it means the right spouse and the right friends. Because those people will love you and help you no matter what you're going through. And when you fall and you're struggling, they're going to be there for you. And I think that a lot of times it's easy to say, oh, well, my family's hard on me, or my spouse is difficult, or my friend's this. We control those things. Mariam said she focuses on what she controls. I control who I spend time with. I control who I marry. I control where I work and what I do for a living. I control which protests I go to. That's all in my hands. And so I guess just those two quick things is the first is see failures and mistakes and challenges as opportunities, as tests from Allah, because He's paying attention to us, because He loves us. And then the second is make sure that you are with the right people, because those opportunities very easily can be turned around and be disasters if we're not surrounded by the right people, if we're not in the right places, and if we don't have access to the right resources.
When I was a kid, I loved to argue a lot. When I was a kid, I say. No, I really liked to argue when I was a kid. And I used to fight a lot, not just with the siblings, but with classmates, with teachers, with anyone. I spent a lot of my time in the corridor. I don't know what the American system is. You do a lot of detention. In the British way, it's much quicker. You just go stand outside the class. I spent a lot of time standing in the corridor, having been thrown out of classrooms for answering back, etc., etc. And my parents spent a lot of time going to parent-teacher evenings, coming back and saying, "What the hell's wrong with you? Why can't you shut your mouth?" And interestingly, I now have a career based on running my mouth. Allah works in mysterious ways. And, I tell people this. I say, as a child, I would get in trouble for having arguments with people and not knowing when to stop. Now people pay me to come on television and radio and argue with people. They'll even fly you business class to argue with people. And I think to myself, how lucky I am. I have this interesting job. When I go to a gathering, I'm with friends of mine. My best friend is a doctor. My cousin is a dentist, people I hang out with. And, we go together and people will say, "Oh, how's life? How's your job?" And they'll get annoyed. No one's asking them about their jobs. And it's great. MashaAllah, blessed by Allah. But come back to Harun's question about failure. Now, personally, MashaAllah, I've done very well. I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. But in terms of what I care about, what I write about, what I campaign about, I'm a total failure. Every issue that matters to me is a total failure. Nothing I wrote or said stopped the Iraq War in 2003. Nothing I've done over the past 60 days in terms of arguing, writing pieces, tweeting, going on the radio, debating the Israeli ambassador to London, blah-de-blah-de-blah. Nothing stopped Israel from bombing Gaza. Nothing has lifted the siege on the people of Gaza. I did a debate at the Oxford Union that some of you will have seen. It went viral. 1.6 million people watched it on YouTube. Didn't stop ISIS from beheading people, or Boko Haram from kidnapping girls, or Western politicians from passing laws or creating surveillance programs that continue to discriminate against or demonize Muslims. It didn't change the world's view of Islam or non-Muslims' views of Islam. May have done at the margins. And I remember a friend of mine, my good friend who's the doctor, he once said to me, "You know what? If you just changed all your views, your life would be so much more fulfilling." And it's so true. You go on these protests against austerity, governments are making cuts everywhere. Record cuts, nothing worked. And I just said, and you asked about failure, and that's the first thing I think of in a sense. How do I not go and self-harm and get depressed when you look at what you're fighting for and what you're standing for and what you're campaigning for, and I've sat on countless panels, countless stages, countless conferences, and you see what is the visible change that we're making or not in the community incrementally, in the world perhaps less so, you have to ask yourself, well, what are you learning from that failure? And I think the only thing I'm learning from that failure, and I can only speak for myself, others can speak for themselves, is that really it's a cliche, but there is no end point to this journey. What we're doing is the journey. Where we're going, it's not necessarily we're trying to reach some light at the end of the tunnel. It's about every day. It's about the daily struggle, as Zahra mentioned. It's about the lifestyle, and it's about keeping doing what you're doing on a daily basis. And if you haven't got the results in this world, perhaps the next world, or perhaps the results will come in a few years' time. And I think that's what I would take from failure and say, well, it depends how you measure the failure, and not to connect it to your daily principles. Just to link back to what the Imam said, people like Muhammad Ali, when they were giving up their belt and going to prison, they were a failure. He had lost in that fight. The American justice system had won in its own way, but no one classes that as a failure today, and I'm sure he didn't see it as a failure at the time. So I think that's what I would say about failure in terms of sticking. I mean, it's cliched, it's obvious, but we have to remind ourselves, it is about sticking to your principles, it is about thinking about the long game rather than the short game, and it is about recognizing that there's not always going to be a victory at the end of, or a light at the end of the tunnel. Harun also asked me, since it's linked into this, to answer is it the first audience question? I believe there's many more. He does not knowing the time. Somebody's asked to me, what are 3 steps we can take together to improve our domestic issues involvement over the next 10 years? I love that. 3 steps, 10 years. It's very, very organized. Someone there from a business school, I'm guessing, or a law school. Not an art student. It's an amazing question. I'm sure there's dozens of steps and over dozens of years. And I'm sure the panelists can answer as well if they want. Off the top of my head, I would say educate yourself. Every Islamic conference or Muslim gathering I go to, people say education. But when I say education, I don't just mean get a medical degree or a law degree or a postgraduate degree. I mean find out what is happening in your societies, in the world around you. The Imam mentioned beautiful line, I think the best line of the night, if you let me say this, let me praise you and say the best line of the night is when you said, wherever things matter, that's where Muslims should be. But how do you know what matters unless you're reading newspapers, reading magazines, watching the dreaded television screen, going online, going on social media, buying books? And when I say reading, a lot of Muslims now, we do read. We consume media like nobody else. You come to Britain, we've got 30-odd Islamic channels, various different languages. Well, I'm not talking about consuming things you agree with. I'm talking about reading what other people are saying, what our opponents are saying, what other communities are saying. As John Stuart Mill once said, you don't know your own side of the argument until you know the other side of the argument. And I worry that in our communities too much, when I'm having conversations with people, the views reflected are reflected of a very narrow, closed mindset from one particular article or one particular website or one particular source of information. So try and educate yourself as broadly as possible. Otherwise, you stand no chance out there when you're trying to debate some of these issues. Very quickly, number 2, I would say reach out. How can you know what's important on a national or a local level if you are only cloistered in your house or your school or your masjid or your community center or your Islamic conference? Those are all important things to do, but also reach out and find out what is going on beyond your comfort zone, beyond your safe space. How do you know what the important issues are in your locality? Unless you're reaching out, unless you're making friends with non-Muslims, with atheists, with Hindus, with agnostics, with Christians, with Jews, etc. Only then can we have the common struggles, as Zahra talked about earlier. Only then can we form those alliances, which will then help us later on down the line. And the third point, I would say, the third argument, the third thing I think we really need to do is we have to get off our backsides. To come back to the laziness point, there is literally no problem. Zahra talked about mobilizing 7 million Muslims. 7 million, that's a tiny number when you think about what some of our opponents are worried about the billions of Muslims around the world. We are a big number of people. And the fact that we don't mobilize ourselves, people talk about in Europe, I don't know if anyone come to Europe with you, the far-right Islamophobe argument in Europe is, there's a Muslim takeover coming. And I always laugh. I think if only you wish Muslims could take over Europe. We can barely take over our local mosque. We can barely take over our own house. The kitchen. I mean, we're far too disorganized and lazy. So I think we must mobilize. We must be able to organize. We must be able to do all these things that we say. but we don't do. There's no reason. There's a beautiful paragraph. Those of you who haven't read it, Imam Majid's response to Professor Tariq Ramadan's recent outburst on all of this was a very interesting response. If you read the penultimate paragraph, I think it is, he makes the very, very obvious point that in our community, we will pick up the phone and ring our friend to complain about what we've seen on TV about some government decision. We won't pick up the phone and ring our congressman, our senator, our mayor, etc. We will complain to our imam about something that's happening in the mosque or some religious issue. We won't go and take part in the mosque or try and elect ourselves to a position to change that from happening. We are backseat drivers, and the only way we can ever change any of this is to get into the front seat.
So there were a lot of questions, and the questions tended to revolve around a number of themes, and unfortunately we don't have enough time for all the questions. So I thought I would start with a brief anecdote to kind of illustrate what I'm trying to get at, because there's something underscoring the questions that I think hopefully if we address, maybe we can address maybe some of these issues. A friend of mine was recently flying on a plane. All these Muslims flying on planes joke are terrible. And he decided to pray on the plane. And as he was praying, the stewardess came by to ask him something and kind of, nudged him, and then saw that he was clearly preoccupied and left. And she came back a few minutes later and she said, I apologize, sir, if I was interrupting you. To which he responded, oh, it's okay, I was praying. To which she responded, that's okay, you don't have to do that anymore, the planes are really safe. So I thought it was a nice little moment of cultural miscommunication, right? Like, what is a prayer? But the reason I say that is, some of the questions we're talking about, divides in the community, facing gender discrimination, facing pressures around career, lifestyle choices, and what I thought I would end with is that all of you are leaders in your fields. All of you have your finger on the pulse of something that, I myself do not and others here may not. So I wanted to ask you, what is one positive trend you see in our communities? Because we tend to just get bad news, right? Like it's always, every time you see something about Islam on the news, you kind of have to take a deep breath because it's just going to kind of stink. What is something you've seen, whether it's your day-to-day life, whether it's big picture politics, whether it's economic, cultural, whatever it is, something you can share that you see that is happening right now that is positive?
So this will make sense. One of the things that you triggered for me earlier was 2003 and the Iraq War demonstrations. And I was in college, and I remember the feeling of defeat and ineffectiveness. And then Mahdi, I think, really touched on it. He said it's the journey, right? That this is the task. And I want to make clear, because I feel like there has been some touching on spirituality within everyone's comments, but similar to the way we talk about doing and talking, we also talk about doing and spirituality, sometimes as if they are separate things. And so most important, in terms of positivity, I think, is that we are starting to talk about it, that we are starting to talk about engagement. Just a couple of years ago, I remember I was meeting with an administrator at a university where they were having problems around Palestine organizing, because the students that were organizing for Palestine were being targeted, they were being silenced, there were groups from off campus targeting them. And we were going to send this advocacy letter from all the lawyers at the table, and one of the lawyers says, so where should we send it? Because we want to make sure you see it. And the administrator looked at us and he smiled. He said, look, we get so few letters from your side that we're not going to lose it. We're going to notice when your one letter comes in, because it's not otherwise coming in. And more recently, around all of the organizing with Gaza, the positive thing for me has been to see the community taking control. I feel like our generation, our parents' generation, and those that are younger than us, because frankly, those of us on stage are getting older, are starting to mobilize. They're raising young kids to go into careers in the media so that they're not just sharing those articles on Facebook. They're calling the editor. They're calling the local elected official. In the Bay Area, where we have some of the most progressive elected officials imaginable in the entire United States, we had only one elected official who voted against the Iron Dome missile defense system. And we're working on getting people to make sure that she is thanked, that she is appreciated, that she knows that the Muslim community stands by her. But there are also those who voted for it. And they are hearing from the community by the hundreds and by the thousands, and that matters because they're noticing. It is no longer acceptable that our elected officials, that our administrators, that our media personalities say, we don't know where your community is. We don't know what they think. And so for me, the positivity has been seeing that mobilization. You'd think I would want to end on a positive note, but I want to say that the concern I have when I see the mobilization that we all saw this summer, that we were all really excited about and really proud about, was how do we sustain it? How do we make sure that we continue to do it on every issue that matters, but also not just when our Facebook friends say that this is what we should do? And so personally, what I've established in my life and what I recommend for folks who are looking to make activism a lifestyle, an ingrained part of who they are and what they do, is to take it one day at a time. When someone converts to Islam, we tell them what the fara'id are, and then we work with them to slowly build that up. But those of you that grew up in Pakistani households know that we don't pray 4 fard and 3 witr for Isha. We pray 17 rak'ah, right? 4 sunnah, 4 fard, 2 sunnah, 2 nafil, 3 witr, 2 nafil. And that's hard. And it takes a really long time. And you don't tell the new convert, all right, welcome to Islam, pray 17 rak'ah tomorrow. Because that's not sustainable. So the same thing is true for our activism. You cannot be at a Gaza protest every day. You cannot visit your elected officials every day. And you cannot drop every unjust and inhumane company overnight. So I quit Walmart. And it took some time, because for those that shop at Walmart, you know how hard it is to avoid Walmart. I quit Walmart. And then I said, okay, what's next? Nestle. And I'm still working on Nestle because little did you know, they own everything. But it's one company at a time. And if I drop all of them tomorrow, that's going to last a day. In the same way that if we tell someone, pray 17 rak'ah tomorrow, that's not sustainable. And so take your excitement, your energy, everything that you learn this weekend, and make a commitment to make one change. And when you master that change, when you're so comfortable with it that you don't miss Nestle drumsticks, pick up something else. And maybe it's Coca-Cola, or maybe it's H&M or Walmart, but do it one step at a time, in the same way that after Ramadan, you add one piece of worship to your life until it's comfortable, and then you add the next. Jazakallah khair.
Okay. Bismillah. So to be brief, we all have a spirit that animates our body. That's regardless of age. If you're alive because of the spirit that God has put in you. What I've seen recently, I'm a part of a generation now that's born Muslim. And there's this sense within the Muslim community that you can inherit faith. And it's a false idea. So what I've seen, and I'll give it to you in a story, after I graduated high school, I went to an all-Muslim high school in Atlanta. It's a school that I'm over now. And there was just this void of a generation of believing firmly in the idea of faith in God. It was just this acceptance of faith in God. And so you see that come about when you believe faithfully that the God is real, then you know He's the all-seeing. You know that He's the all-knowing. You know that He's the all-wise. You have this attention with your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that helps govern your actions and behavior. So I say that to say that people went buck wild. They went to the far, far left of life, and they had this two-faced mentality towards the community, where they would be before the community as though they were Muslim. We're all experiencing it. I know it in the masajid. They had two faces, one before the community and one behind closed doors with friends, etc. And so I left the United States. I went and studied at the American University of Dubai, thinking that I would be in a cultural environment where Muslims would be Muslim I was studying international business, would be concerned about matters of business world as well as international things, but still have this core faith belief globally. And to my shock, some of you all may not be shocked, but for me, living and sacrificing to be Muslim in America and really kind of standing up for my faith, to be with Muslims that were Muslim for 10, 15 generations, for 1,000 years, to find that they don't make salat was just heart-dropping. That they don't make salat. That was heart-dropping. Maybe you understand, but for me, it was devastating. That I've traveled 6,000 miles to be amongst people who don't believe in this religion with sincerity. And there was about 5 of us who made the Jummah Salat. And of course, in the Arab world, Friday is off. So this was an eye-opening, awakening for me that there's this void of spirituality in human beings that has to be corrected. There is a problem here. It's not being discussed, and it's global. It's not just amongst second-generation Muslims in the African-American community or in America who are coming into this, quote, inheritance. But this is a global thing of how the human being has to really take charge of his life and come back to faith. This is a real issue across the world, but I want to just stress that it's a real issue in our masajid across America. That just because we're physically there, it doesn't mean that we're present. And we have youth and we have children who are in our midst who aren't being challenged to think for themselves. They're just being required to mimic and act as though they're Muslim. And it's unhealthy for their future life. What I've witnessed that is very positive today is this amazing return of young adults to the masjid. And they're coming back with life experiences that have redirected and changed their perspective to say that this way of life is perfect for me. And I want to be critically engaged, meaning thinking as I move through the growth in my spirituality, the practice of the religion of Al-Islam. I want to be thinking, I want to be engaged on the highest level so that I can continue to receive the benefits. And I'm seeing it every day, young Muslims coming into the masjid and being sincere for the first time about who they are and being open about their faith and their attention to their faith. And I think this is a wonderful occurrence. It is only by God that we become Muslim. هُوَ يَهْدِي مَن يَشَاءُ وَيُضِلُّ مَن يَشَاءُ. And we bear witness to that every day. May Allah guide us all and protect us always. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum.
Something that gives me so much hope is the fact that Muslims really care. And I mean care about what we've done. So many of us, myself, I'm sure many of you, have done something really messed up before and just felt like I really screwed up. I did something that God's going to be really displeased with me because I did this. And then sometimes that drives you to feel so guilty and overwhelmed that it makes you wonder what your relationship is with Him. I have been honored to receive questions from so many individuals of different age groups, and every single time their question is, I did this with a guy, I did this with a girl, I've had these doubts in faith, I've done self-harm, I've done drugs, I've been sexually abused, I've XYZ over and over and over, and the ramifications of those issues. But over and over, every single person wants to know, what should I do with my relationship with Allah from here on? How does this affect my relationship with God? And to me, the fact that people are driven by guilt is not necessarily a good thing, but it is an indicator that we care. And caring about a relationship with God is the most important care to have. And the fact that our community has it in droves means that there's so much good amongst us. In addition to that, one thing that I think slowly our community is learning is that we can't preach to people in a way that causes them to hate themselves. The doom and gloom khutbah. I would summarize this past year, probably the best summary that I can give to you of the Friday khutbah that I've been hearing is, y'all suck. And also, hell's real. It's so painful to hear that message when in reality the Quran tells us in the 25th chapter that those of us who make big mistakes, there's a verse that talks about huge sins, and then it says, except for those who repent, who believe, and who do righteous deeds. God will change, He will literally replace their bad deeds with good deeds. And what that means is the Prophet always told them, explain to us on the day of judgment, a person's gonna come and they're gonna be really worried about seeing their records because they know they really, really messed up. And when the records are shown to them, they're like, did you do this? Did you do this? And he's like, of course, yes. He can't deny it. He knows he did it. And he's worried about the bigger stuff that he's not even seeing. And then God, out of his incredible mercy, tells that his deeds, replace those bad deeds with good ones. If a person repents, comes back to God, wants to live a life of pleasing him, even if we mess up over and over and over, just do the process all over again, inshallah, all the things we've messed up on will be turned into good deeds. And so this guilt that we feel, that sometimes we don't know if God has forgiven us, in reality, it's us not being able to forgive ourselves. He's already forgiven us. He already loves us. He loves us so much. He's forgiven us and replaced it with good deeds. Now we need to forgive ourselves for the things that we've done. We just need to move forward from that because he already has. So the point is, one of the most beloved things that I love about our community is one, that we care about our state, and two, is that even though sometimes our preaching has to do with shame, blame, and guilt, I think we're starting to move towards recognizing that we're all human beings. God tells us we're going to mess up, but if the sins of us were to reach to the clouds and we believe in him and don't associate parties with him, he'll forgive us without an issue. So because we're starting to go towards that type of discussion, I'm very, very excited, inshallah, about the next generation of our community.
I didn't even realize this was supposed to be some kind of youth-oriented thing till I turned up. So when Zara talks about our ages, I can't speak for anyone else on the panel, but I'm certainly not a representative of the youth.
I don't think anyone's
No, the grey hair, and I'm 35. When I was a kid, we played outside. That's how old I am. There were lawns, indeed. So on that note, talking about the future, as someone who's in the middle, neither young nor old. To take your question about positivity and positiveness, I'm a very negative person. My wife will tell you that. I'm always, glass is always half empty. But let me be positive, and let me say this. What do you think is the one of the top criticisms that both Muslims and non-Muslims have about the Muslim community? I think it's fair to say leadership. I think for years, non-Muslims have said, these Muslim communities, they're run by extremists, they're run by conservatives, they're run by people who don't want to integrate. And in our community, we've all complained about the various Uncle G's and others, self-appointed is a phrase that's only ever used in the Muslim community. I've never actually used it in a sentence to do with anything else other than Muslim community leaders. It's often used, self-appointed leader. In Britain, it's a big common criticism that the Muslim community lacks leaders. The Muslim community has gone down all sorts of dead ends because of bad leadership. We don't have good people leading us. We don't have good people speaking on our behalf. And so if you're going to ask me to be positive, I give this example. After 9/11, I was a researcher for a TV company, for ITV, which is one of the main networks, like NBC here, ITV in the UK. And my boss said, well, go out, and your job, Mehdi, Muslim guy in the office, your job is to get some good Muslim leaders to come on and talk about terrorism. People who speak really good English and are really dynamic and are really this and that. And I said, they don't exist. Where am I supposed to find them? I can spend all day banging a phone. This is Britain 2001. If you look at what's happening in the British media now with British Muslims, if you look what's happening in the United States now, I think there are massive signs of positivity. Harun said earlier, when he introduced one of the questions, you're all leaders. I'm not the leader of anything. My leader is my wife. I don't lead anything. And I couldn't lead any, I'm the last person to lead anything. Very disorganized, very chaotic. If there's a fire, don't follow me. So let me just say, these three, however, we have an imam, we have civil rights activists from CARE, we have a scholar and activist here. I would say, look at these three people on stage. I go to Muslim conferences across America now. It's my 5th one of 2014. I am absolutely inspired and energized by the people I meet. And sorry if I sound patronizing, but especially female leaders who I meet in our community doing amazing things, picking fights with police commissioners to congressmen, to foreign governments. And I will say, you know what? I go back to the UK and say, I'm inspired. That's positive. Let's stop talking about the cliched example of the bad Muslim community leader. Let's look at some of the leaders and activists we have now, some of whom are on this stage, and say, you know what? We're in a good place right now. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much, everyone, for an amazing panel, all your insights. Thank you for sticking around through it. Please give them another round. And apologies if we kept you a little bit late. We're trying to be culturally sensitive by being a little off.
Wonderful panel. and to Harun for moderating and for being the discussant. I hope all of you are enjoying the conversations we're having and benefiting from them. I just want to remind you that 9 o'clock sharp, inshallah, we're going to start our last session of the night, and the topic of that session is why culture matters. You have Imam Zaid Shakir, Dr. Sherman Jackson, Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir, and you have Brother Ali, who's an artist, and you have Alex Cronemer, who's a film producer, and Maryam Sobr, who's going to moderate the panel. So you won't want to miss it. It's going to be an incredible conversation, inshallah. So I look forward to seeing you all back here at 9 p.m., inshallah. And have a nice dinner and a nice prayer break. Assalamu alaikum.
IMANA is working relentlessly to promote Islamic medical ethics, helping members achieve growth through CMEs, bringing together medical students, residents, practicing physicians, and medical faculty to share knowledge